Hi, and welcome back to Continual. Tonight we're here to discuss all things Eldritch Horror. We're going to be talking Lovecraft and Lovecraft-inspired stories, films, books, all the good stuff. So to see who is going to go along into this land of existential dread, I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and Derek, would you like to introduce yourself as, well, we see if the tentacles grab who first?
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. My name is Derek Austin Johnson. I am tentacle free at the moment, but generally speaking, I write horror fiction. I've had stories in Parsec magazine as well as Generation X and the Splatterpunk award-winning Camp Slasher Lake Volume 1. My novel, The Faith, was published in 2024. Fan of the Eldritch and the Cosmic.
Jenny?
Hi, I'm Gini Koch. I write the Alien Catherine Kitty Cat series. I also write a variety of other series and standalone novels, short stories, novelettes, novellas, and under a variety of other pen names. And as J.C. Koch, I write short horror, and at least half of it is Lovecraftian.
Marx?
Hey, I'm Marx Pyle. I'm a filmmaker, writer, person. I've done some indie film with Lovecraftian stuff in it. I've also am founder of Capacross Publishing, where we have different anthologies like Tales of Monstrosity and Once Upon a Twisted Time, which have some Lovecraftian inspired stories in there. And I've enjoyed Lovecraft since I read it in probably high school or something, and all the different spin-offs of it.
Fraser?
I'm Fraser Sherman. I write historical fantasy and nonfiction film reference. I've also written a couple of Lovecraftian short stories, Signs and Hortense, and The Happiest Place on Earth. Both of them are somewhat on the humorous side.
Carole?
Hi, I'm Carole Stokes, a frequent continual panelist. As Ellis Colton, I write romance, including paranormal romance. And I read my first Lovecraft in middle school and just fell in love with the language from the get-go.
So I kind of want to start from probably a little bit different angle this time. I mean, because again, predominantly we all write a bunch of things that would be Lovecraftian inspired. It's one of those things that is an influence in so much of culture, even for people that don't necessarily watch horror, don't necessarily read horror. Lovecraft, to have been like many creators, dying, broke, penniless, kind of lived his own eldritch horror in his own way. But I think it'd be interesting to see how he'd interpret his influence on the world we're in today. I think he'd probably be a little bit traumatized by it, which would be a little bit fitting. So, looking at this notion of cosmic horror, eldritch horror, and the influences that he's had, Derek, I want to kind of go to you from, whether it's one of Lovecraft's own stories, whether it is all the different interpretations we've seen over the years. What's one for you that you find to be very influential, especially if it's influential for you?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And it's funny, too, because for the longest time, I had a very strong love-hate relationship with Lovecraft. I liked some of it. I didn't like a lot of it. It was something I actually had to develop, where I had to actually acquire my taste for it. So, but having said that, I think the one that really sort of jolted me was Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, which it was, it's based on, we all know the story it's based on, but it was so dynamic and so off the wall, and to say nothing of probably amphetamine fueled in some respects, but it was so unique and so different from anything else that I was seeing at that time that it made me actively seek out more of Lovecraft's work to at least just try to figure out what it was, I was missing with a lot of that. Another one really was, and it was really The Shadow over Innsmouth. that made and its subsequent movie also by Stuart Gordon, which was a Dagon, which really did sort of that moved the needle in so many different ways. It had almost everything I like: strange goings on in a small town, this decrepit New England setting. So I mean, all of that has spoken to me a great deal since I first read it and viewed it. As an aside, I recently reread John Steinbeck's Cannery Row, and then his subsequent sequel to that, Sweet Thursday. And you could see elements of Weird Tales sort of creeping into those books. And it always sort of bummed me out that Steinbeck never decided to go the cosmic horror route. That would have been something. So,
Jenny, how about for you? Knowing how much you're a fraidy cat, as you were so proud of saying, and yet...
I wasn't okay. My first love is mysteries. So I grew up in a small town about an hour north of Los Angeles, and I was a voracious reader. And so, the Ellery Queen magazine and the Alfred Hitchcock magazine would come in, and I'd read them while waiting for my mother to pick me up from the library. I can still remember at 12 demanding, where's the next Nero Wolfe? Keeping in mind that in my hand is the one that released the day before. And I had it first. And I was done. And the librarian was done because she was tired of this 12-year-old coming in and demanding more in mystery because I read it out. Okay. There was nothing else. And she took me and said, come with me. Walked me over to the horror section and said, you haven't read anything in here. And look how many shelves we've got. And so I started reading horror. And I hit Lovecraft, and it was great. Two of his in particular really affected me, and they affected me for life. One is Pickman's Model. I'll talk more about that later when we're talking about books stuff that inspired our own writing. And this also inspired my own writing. But the story of his that broke my heart was The Outsider. My heart broke. Because the problem that I had with the story is that the narrator is this sweet, gentle soul, just wants to find love and light. And he gets out and, looks at himself, and he's terrifying everybody because he's a ghoul. But he is not evil. He is not bad. He just looks hideous. And I was so heartbroken that he accepted that he was evil and he was horrible, that when I got the chance, I wrote Outsiders, which I gave that character the happily ever after that I always felt he deserved. And that's never not affected me. And when I reread it, I cry because it's wrong. It's like, it's not fair. And the lack of fairness just affected me forever. And it's like, it was one of those things that I'm like, it doesn't matter what someone looks like on the outside. It matters what's inside. And this was a pure, loving, lost little soul. And because he was hideous, he decided to accept his fate. And I couldn't do that. So I wrote a new ending for him that got published. So yeah. So those two really were important to me. I mean, they're Victorian, so they're written very differently than we write them now. He's coming late Victorian, early, 20th century. And that's where, it's like, gas, Hastings, what happened? Oh my God, man. It was unbelievable. The horrors I've seen. Have a brandy and tell me about it. We don't tell stories like that anymore. So they're harder and harder for me to reread. But The Outsider doesn't flow like that. Pickman's Model does, but The Outsider does not. So I love that story. It's my favorite, with Pickman's Model coming second. Though Pickman's Model is why I started reading all of Lovecraft.
Marx?
I was trying to think back. I think, I first started off with Edgar Allan Poe and then Stephen King and stuff, right? And I was touching on Lovecraft stuff, not realizing that's what it was at first. I think what really got me on Lovecraft, or really paying attention to it being Lovecraftian and trying to interconnect that stuff, was I think when I watched it in the Mouth of Madness movie, So that was very Lovecraftian, and really made me start to go, what is this about and stuff, and start looking back at different things and looking at different movies and stuff, like that whole Apocalypse trilogy thing and other things. When I'm reading those stories, trying to think about which ones I really like, I agree with what you just said, with The Outsider. That did have a big effect on me when I first read it. That reveal and everything at the end of it. I think maybe, and it really does really resonate with me or stick with me, because like a lot of his protagonists are very kind of, unrelatable or just kind of vague characters that I guess you can kind of feel yourself in their POV maybe. But in that one, you feel like you get to know the character a little bit, and then you're surprised when you really find out the character. Besides those, like big concept stuff that really resonate with me was Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness. I love to see Mountains of Madness in big screen, and for some reason, like the imagery and stuff, like Rats in the Walls, really stuck with me too. And there's a lot of weird stuff as that goes that is never explained and never really picked up. They're just like, there's another story in here. Let's we can explore it more. And it's a lot of Lovecraft, right? There's a lot of pieces there where you're like, I wish there was more, and because it's public domain, we can explore that.
Fraser?
It's not his best or his favorite, but the one that stuck with me as a kid, because I found it the scariest, was the statement of Randolph Carter, in which Randolph Carter and his friend Hardy Warren are exploring this underground tomb in New Orleans with all kinds of strange legends, and Warren goes into it and finds this vast underground complex, and he's talking back on the little walkie-talkie, and then something sees him, and he's running for the exit, and he's running, and suddenly it goes silent, and Randolph Carter's sitting there, Harley, are you there? And then suddenly he hears, you fool, he's dead. It's like, oh, God. And that one stuck with me for years and still does. Beyond that, I started reading Lovecraft actually with the August Derleth. Take some of Lovecraft's ideas and pretend they're a collaboration, which are not good. But then I got into the real stuff, and I read the whole collection of Lovecraft a few years ago, and I find I can get into probably 50% of them very well still, despite the strangeness and the strange language and all the other Lovecraftianness of them.
Carole, how about for you? You're on mute.
I don't usually mute, but I didn't know how loud my air conditioner was being.
You're good.
My first Lovecraft was The Color Out of Space, and I read it in like 7th grade. I was absolutely one of those kids who was reading anything and everything like way early. I had untrammeled access to my parents' books, the library, and I was already reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and to discover horror was just absolutely delicious. I often scared myself because I would be home alone when my parents had gone to work and I had to wait to go to school. Or I would come home from school and the house would be empty. So there were times I was like, you cannot read any more horror right now, because I would envision like disembodied heads coming down my hallway. But at the same time that I read my early exposure, which the first one was Color Out of Space, and then it was a little bit staggered because to me that was a one-off. I read it in an anthology, so I never like kind of pursued it more. I was reading a ton of Bradbury. I was reading, like I said, other horror stuff. The Yellow Wallpaper and all this stuff, and it's stuff like Bradbury and Lovecraft. Their language is gorgeous. It's like poetry. And so, I read everything from Bradbury. And then I, started realizing, oh, this Lovecraft guy has more than just this one short story. But I kind of got it after that in bits and pieces. But it's the same thing. The language, although the language can be very dense, is nonetheless so image rich and evocative, and the moodiness, and sometimes you don't quite know what's going on, but it's very enticing, and you have a little room to just kind of imagine it, and he just covered so many kind of different areas despite kind of having a central vibe to him. And it just, I ate it up like catnip. And as I became an adult, I didn't read Stephen King till I was in my 30s. So of course, then I can see the references and stuff. And that's why I like a lot of King stuff, because he has that whole, Castle Rock has that moodiness and mystery and darkness. And I love that stuff. And it's influenced me as a writer, and I can't wait to write more of it. And I don't know how much more we're going to talk about that as a whole separate thing, but it's, man, when I saw this panel come up, I was like, I got to do this, because this isn't something a lot of people get, or they only have ever seen like a movie, or, and frankly, the movies I've seen, I haven't seen a really good one, compared to what its stories are. So I just, it's one of the ones I'm really passionate about as an influence on me as a reader, as a writer, as in the way my mind works, which it could be a little scary.
Well, and
yeah, I absolutely adore it.
In the Mouth of Madness, by the way, my husband came home from watching that and looked at me and said, "You can never, ever have watched that movie." Everything of Lovecraft, and it's all on the screen, and you will never sleep again. I'm like, okay. So I can definitely tell you that's a good adaptation.
Well, and I keep wanting to see the Guillermo del Toro version that he's talked about for
oh yes
ever.
Yeah,
oh my God, that would be fabulous. That would be
yes, I think that he is absolutely someone who could do justice.
Well, and so when we look at Lovecraft, because again, we primarily think in terms of Lovecraft as, the Cthulhu mythos, Miskatonic University, the Dunwich Horror, a lot of these stories that are that classic, that classic tale. And there's a lot of stories that he wrote that are outside of that, where he took a few shots at comedy-ish, took a few shots at other stories as well. But one of the ones that kind of does still fall into that mythos that I remember sticking with me is The Shadow Out of Time, right? That alien, the alien world, the body hopping. I was a big fan of things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and so many of these stories and films. And in a lot of ways, that particular story popped in and spoke to me. And I've written things that I can probably say I didn't think about it, but they're directly influenced by that story. So when we look at some of these kinds of influences, let's spend a little bit of time talking about some of your writing and where some of these influences might have crept in. And, what are the things that do kind of work their way in, whether it's directly from Lovecraft and Lovecraftian stories, or, it goes through a few head hops before it gets to us, because obviously there's been a few other works created between now and then. So, Jenny, how about for you? What's something you can look and say, nope, this is woven its way into my work. It's this kind of an influence. And so, thoughts?
Well, one of the things I've always loved about Lovecraft is he was a come play in my sandbox guy while he was alive. It didn't matter that it made it into, copyright free. He was always like, no, I've created this, come play. And that gave me, especially as a younger writer, the feeling like, okay, I feel guilty writing Sherlock Holmes. I got over it. But I don't feel guilty writing anything Lovecraftian, because if I'd been a contemporary, he would have said, sure, my lass, give it a shot, right? So that really affected me a lot. So when I had chances to write horror, it was almost, I write two kinds, creepy children and Lovecraftian. Okay, sometimes creepy Lovecraftian children, but mostly creepy children and Lovecraftian is most of the horror I write. And one of the first pieces I did, I had done, it was a Lovecraftian horror, $20, $25, right? And I took the prompt, I wrote a 10,000 word story. A Big Thank You from the Little Lady. And it's set in the Old West, and it's got all the creepy hallmarks. And I was really proud of it. And I looked at it, I thought, I'm not burning this story on $20. And so I saved it. And I had the opportunity to be in The Madness of Cthulhu, Volume 1. And S.T. Joshi, who is basically the premier Lovecraftian scholar, when my agent sent it in, she goes, she wants to know if it's worthy. And he wrote back, it is more than worthy. This belongs in the Pantheon. This is excellent. I can't believe she hasn't published more. And I was just like, okay, I'm walking on air, number one. And number two, I'm so glad I didn't burn that story. And it's funny, though, because he said, I want to change the title a little. And I'm like, anything, sir. Right? And he said, I just want it to be Little Lady because A Big Thank You from the Little Lady feels kind of snarky. And I'm like, oh, that was intentional. But you get to choose, sir, as the editor. So it's been hugely influential. I mean, that was one of my first, and it was my first really big, well, I had two prior, but it was like my third really big story. And it was sold not as Gini Koch, but as J.C. Koch. So that was really huge for me that I could write under an additional pen name that was going to sell, right? Not just because I wanted to, but because someone wanted to buy it. So Lovecraft's been hugely influential in my writing and my career since before I really had a real, my starting career. So, I mean, anytime I have Cthulhu monsters in the Alien series, they're cuddly because it's mine and I can make it how I want. But they're only cuddly because my heroine is somebody who treats everybody like a person. And they're like, she's not thinking there's monsters. They're just big people with, scary, but they're people. And they love her for that. So I use it wherever I can. A little Lovecraft can slip in anywhere because it fits. And you can make the joke or you can not make the joke. But no, he's actually been probably realistically one of the most influential writers for me as an author. And again, it's because he was come play in my sandbox, so I never felt guilty. I always felt welcomed.
How about for you, Marx? What are some of the ways that it's infused its way through some of your work?
Yeah. So my urban fantasy world, Obsidian Archives, has a lot of everything from urban fantasy, but I do weave in a lot of Lovecraftian stuff into it. I guess I just feel like good urban fantasy uses all folklore, and I feel like to me, Lovecraftian has become a folklore. So partly because Lovecraft was very open to letting people use it from the get-go, and then it went into public domain. So I think that all helped it out. And I also I went back eventually and read some of the stories that influenced Lovecraft too. And except for having less tentacles, I can see where there's influences there and the Keenan Yellow and all that good stuff. So I'm always mixing in some stuff here and there. And I think what's cool also about a Lovecraftian type genre or Lovecraftian elements is that it's very open to different genres. So we have comedy, we have action adventure, we have all sorts of stuff. It's everywhere, not just horror. I mean, that's the most pure, I guess, Lovecraftian, but it's all over the place, and people like that and embrace it, which is nice. Which is what we do with vampires and werewolves and stuff too, right? So yeah, Obsidian Archives has a lot of it, and I've had other stories. Some stories that are darker has elements of it. I worked on a short film where I actually had a con lane expert, Brenton Watkins, construct a language based, kind of the ACLO or whatever you want to call it, language that we get a very snippet of in Call of Cthulhu. I played around with that, so it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
Fraser?
Neither of my two Lovecraftian stories, it's sort of, okay, this will work if I bring Lovecraft into it. There is Happiest Place on Earth started as a joke with a friend of mine about the children's show, The Mickey Mygo Club. Now it's time to say goodbye to our humanity. Hastur, he's our destiny. And so in the story, Mickey Mygo has just discovered that studio head Walt Alhazred is canceling the Mickey Mygo Club. You do not do that to Mickey Mygo. He is an icon. People have said so. And it follows from there. And in the other one, Signs and Hortense, I started thinking about what it would be like if Lovecraftian churches were just, cults were just normal churches, like Strange High Church of the Mist and Dunwich Reformed, and the protagonist is a woman from a fundamentalist father, and she's very repressed, and she does not know how miserable she has it, and she's waiting for the rapture, and finally she's starting to get a life, and then the rapture comes, and she's sucked into the afterlife. So it was strange, but I had a lot of fun with it. Both of those appeared in somewhat non-conventional Lovecraftian anthologies.
Carole?
Because I love the whole genre of it. I mean, it's always kind of been, if I'm writing anything that has a paranormal or, supernatural kind of angle to it, at the very least, it's in the back of my mind, infusing it. The way he describes things, the things he describes, are just always kind of concepts that are in the back of my head as I write this kind of thing. Now, I do have a book coming out very shortly. I'll be on hot off press real soon, called The Malevolent Sea. So you can kind of guess maybe what's going to be a bit of an influence in there, where yes, it's New England, and there's cliffs, and there's the sea, and bad things happening, and things that don't appear as they do appear, and things that appear one way that then are really another, which was another thing that happened a lot. Like, am I seeing this right? Am I seeing it wrong? Am I really seeing this at all? When like we see the characters first experiencing the people who are turning into fish and everything. And I really, so for the Malevolent Sea, I really went after that tone and that influence. It's all my stuff. It's all my story, but that coloration is definitely in there. And I really just wanted to say, yeah, bring it in here. Let's just do it out front, out and proud.
Derek?
It's almost entirely been accidental when it's happened. I don't, and this really is sort of the power of influence. You don't realize you're doing it until you're part of the way through it sometimes. One of my first published stories under my own name, I wrote for a booklet in World Fantasy Convention called Skull Fragments. I started it, and I basically went, okay, this will be a quick 4,000 word story. It stopped being that about 5,000 words in, and I realized I can't do that. So I wrote something entirely different about office politics, which just happened to feature, eldritch horrors in the storerooms and that sort of thing. So when I finished the second one, it's basically the worst road trip from hell, which was on I-10 in East Texas, and a lot of that was spawned because one of the towns in East Texas was in Chambers County, and if you ever go to I-10, if you're ever driving from Houston to Beaumont, you have this giant. It's like a statue of an alligator. And it's basically a reptile farm, and I've passed that a number of times, and I'm going, I've got to use that at some point. But and even though that particular thing isn't actually in either of any of my stories, it has showed up as inspiration twice, just completely unconsciously, both because both tending to be weird East Texas, weird, and strange, cosmic sort of shenanigans. And it's also, and part of it also is just bred from the fact that I was obsessed at a very young age with the Guyana Jim Jones sort of thing. And if you look at it just right, all of that has Lovecraftian undertones to it.
Mhm.
So, so it shocks me to no end how often I keep going back to that wellspring. There is something that is completely unresolved or that I'm completely traumatized by. And so as a consequence, I can never not do it. Even when I've written slasher stuff, there is there's almost a liminal cosmic horror element to it.
So, Marks, I'm going to come to you on this one. And because, I mean, we talked a little bit about Reanimator. We've talked a little bit about In the Mouth of Madness. I think we can even look at films like Event Horizon as being a direct ancestor of Lovecraft and cosmic horror. But what do you think it is about film? Because, I mean, so much of Lovecraft specifically and so much of cosmic horror, so much of the Eldritch horror is what you don't see, and it is the psychological aspects of it. It's what your mind fills in. So when you're thinking in terms of stories brought to film, whether it's TV, movies, whatever else, even games, things like that, where we see people trying to interpret so many of these images and ideas. What's something there where you've seen it done that, again, done well or not, because again, it's a hard one to do. We look at something like Reanimator is fun. But again, the story it's based on, Reanimator, right? You've got these notions. So when you think about trying to present these kinds of stories on film, what is it to you about the story, the setting? Is there a good example of that really echoes for you as a true, good, solid Lovecraftian horror?
That really captured Lovecraft. Like if Lovecraft was a filmmaker somehow. I think there's like three that come to mind off the top of my head. Some are more Lovecraft than others. One that was also one of my favorite short stories of all time is it was also a very good movie. Was The Mist, which is a Stephen King story, right? And that's very much where you can't see, you're scared about what you can't see. You only get little snippets of it. Well, it drags you into the mist and kills you. So, it brings in, Stephen King brings in his normal thing where he brings normal people and brings them life and kind of does social commentary of clashes of people in these difficult situations. But we get the Lovecraftian of the unknown, Lovecraftian of bizarre reactions sometimes to the unknown. And at least for the movie, it's very dark at the end. So another thing is, I already mentioned The Mouth of Madness. I think the Color Out of Space from the Nicolas Cage one in 2019, I thought captured the vibe quite well for a modern movie. And I think Nicolas Cage did a great job. I think they all did a great job capturing this kind of vibe of it in a modern element. And another one, it's indie film I really liked and really stuck with me after I watched it was The Endless, which had to do with two brothers who had left a cult and decided to come back or drawn back to it from a videotape, and it gets stuck. Bizarre things happen, and it's very bizarre, very Lovecraftian vibe to it, and just a very good story about the two brothers too that really gets you hooked into the story. So those are a few. So you got two that are very influenced by Lovecraft, I feel, and then one that is an adaptation of a Lovecraft story that I think for a modern adaptation, trying to take it serious or seriously bizarre horror, I think did a good job for me.
Fraser?
The H.P. Lovecraft Appreciation Society has done a few films, I'm not sure how many, and they did a Call of Cthulhu. And, you have the obvious problem that in any Lovecraftian film, the things you are supposed to see that make you go, it's so alien, I am now insane, are not going to look so alien that they drive the viewer insane. I mean, the Nicolas Cage Color Out of Space, the color out of space is basically purple. I wasn't so much a fan, but with the obvious point that Cthulhu does not look like something that would drive you to madness, Call of Cthulhu was a very faithful adaptation, and it's done in black and white and with stop motion, so it looks like a movie out of that era. It's done as a silent, and I thought it was extremely effective, and I enjoyed it. Also, while the Dunwich horror movie from the late 60s was not good, the opening credits, which sort of show the backstory of how everything came to be, are extremely creepy, and they are worth watching, and then just skip the rest of the movie.
Carol?
I've really only seen, I'll have to go back and see some of these because I haven't seen The Color Out of Space. And I don't think I've seen the Mountains at the Edge of Madness. I did see a remake of the Dunwich horror, and I was very excited because I was like, oh, it's, here it's new and fresh and they're going to do something decent. And I just remember by 20 minutes in, I'm like, this is a piece of crap. And being very annoyed. I don't know what they did. They mucked up the story or something, and that's cardinal sin to me.
Is that the
19? Do a story like this, do the damn story.
Is that not? Are you talking about the 1971, or was this a newer one?
There was one that was like late 80s.
Oh, yeah, it was like late 80s or something, and I was like, but certainly, and of course, because it really does influence King, that then you see it in some of the King movies. I mean, Pennywise to me is totally that kind of, he's in the sewers, he's coming out of the dank, moist darkness and, freaking people out who are seeing these again. Here's my perception of reality is being altered. What's real? What's not real? Why can he be there and then here? And where is he in the past? But now he's in the present. And what's going on? And in The Stand, because there you have that whole concept of something starts off very small. This very small thing has happened in this murky, fishy town. But then it starts leading to, I think somebody referred to as these cosmic consequences. And that's certainly what happened here, where you have this little thing. Yeah, well, it decimates, the population. But the point is, we go from the daily and the minute to, hey, cosmic battle between good and evil. And just where does Flag come from anyway? And perception of reality being altered, and the whole darkness and all of this stuff that I don't think we could have that kind of thing without the writers and the people who are visualizing this having had some experience with Lovecraft, because it takes reading and experiencing something like that to allow your mind to even conceive of it. You can't imagine something. I don't mean you can't imagine something, because we all imagine our own things. However, seeing something portrayed in this kind of way introduces a new way for you to then imagine your own. It kind of opens up this whole new sphere. Like if you're an interior decorator and you're doing these wonderful rooms, and then it's like all of a sudden you realize, hey, there's this great new color. It's called purple, and voila, all of a sudden your work is infused with this new information along those lines.
Derek?
Yeah, I'm often more fascinated by Lovecraft influenced work than straight adaptations, and I think part of it is just that it's really difficult to get his sense of rhythm, because it's almost everything works because of his prose, and it's hard to get a lot of those ideas on screen. If you can film something that is indescribable, well, it's no longer indescribable. But on the other hand,
Galactus is a big mist.
Exactly. Or as Fraser, said, the color out of space is purple. So I mean, there's always that frustration. Having said that, a lot of the stuff I tend to like is very much going to be in the vein of Lovecraft. Marx, you mentioned The Endless, and I'd recommend almost anything by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead. They did a movie called Spring, which is very much a romance, and it builds up to what's going to be a really uncomfortable horror. And it changes midway. I don't want to give anything away about that, but the revelation partway through the movie actually turns it into something that's far more fascinating than a standard horror movie. There's a movie called The Beach House, which was released in 2020, about a couple who goes to this young man's father's beach house, where they find out that somebody else is using it. It's a friend of this guy's father's. But at the same time, there is all of a sudden high weirdness that starts to occur on the beach. I absolutely love that movie, and I love the fact that it's going to draw to its logical conclusion. One more that I'm going to recommend is called Absentia, which was directed by Mike Flanagan in, I want to say 2011 or 2012. But it is the story centers around this pregnant woman whose husband has been missing for 7 or 8 years, something like that. Her sister comes to stay with her and begins to realize that there is something going on in the tunnel that connects their apartment complex to a street on the opposite side. It's really eerie. And it really captures that sort of sense of the unknown and of cosmic dread. I happen to absolutely love that movie, even if it seems to be forgotten in the wake of some of Flanagan's other successes.
Yeah, that was his first feature film they did, his indie film.
Jenny?
Despite expectations, I actually have one. This is my earliest memory of something that I can now look back and say, oh, that has Lovecraftian influences. It is not a great movie. The Sentinel. The idea of the Sentinel is that there's this apartment building, and I think it's San Francisco, but it could be anywhere, where our heroine, who is a fashion model, is making a change in her life, and she moves into this building where there is a blind, reclusive old priest. And it gets real, and it's all real creepy. And the priest is dying, and he has to pass along who's going to guard the portal, basically. And it's her, right? She's got to stay there forever, but by the time that happens, she's accepted she has to do this. But a lot of the creatures were very, coming out, they're horrible. Now, my mother, because I was young, so I'm seeing this with my mother, because my mother had absolutely no good parenting skills when it came to what I was watching in visual entertainment standard. My mother is furious because she's like, what they're saying is those people are deformed. They're not evil. That's someone with leprosy. That's somebody, that's got a bulbous thing. These are not, they're saying that if you're deformed, you're evil, and that's wrong. And that upset her greatly. So I remembered that, but they weren't all like that. There was some creepy stuff in there. It was definitely a cosmic kind of horror. Yes, the good Catholics are holding back hell from everybody, but it's a kind of hell that I hadn't seen shown before. And it's something that I thought, all things considered, they did pretty well. I remember this movie far better than I should. It's not, like I said, it's not a great movie. Its ratings are bad. Okay, it was rated badly when it became released. It's still rated badly now. But I can look at that and say, oh, you had a Lovecraftian influence. You were trying to do, and you didn't have the budget to do it right. And so you just went for deformities as opposed to true eldritch horror. But if you think about how Lovecraft describes people, they're horribly, the fish people and the other people and everything else. So it's along the same lines. You could say, well, those people are just deformed and they look like fish. Or it could be, no, actually, they're scary evil. So it tried. And I think it didn't succeed very well. But by golly, we were there. I was way too young to have seen that movie, but it stuck with me. And so if you're looking for a Lovecraftian influence, what I consider kind of early on. Lovecraft, no one was praying to Cthulhu in 1977, just FYI, right? That just wasn't a thing. So I just think it's really interesting. It's something to watch. It's not the best, but it is a really early use of cosmic horror with, I guess, the budget they had.
Well, and I've got to throw in there True Detective, the first season of it, very much. Now, obviously, The King in Yellow was an influence on that, which then carried through. But I mean, the first season of that, one of the things I found fascinating and really fun to watch with that is because really, as you went along, you got to me, which is the core of good Lovecraftian stories, which is the effect on that narrator. It's the story and the effect it has on the people, right? It's not what does the creature look like. It's not anything other than watching somebody go through that torment and to see what comes out of the other side, or as most often doesn't happen, they don't come out of the other side. Or at least we don't see where they necessarily wind up. So, I mean, in terms of looking at things that definitely hold that influence, obviously there have been things like Lovecraft Country. There have been a lot of other stories. So, Fraser, when we look at some of these stories and the elements, because we've been talking around this a lot, cosmic horrors, the Eldritch horrors, Lovecraftian stories, those elements, those things that are all doing well, what for you is one of those kind of elements and motifs to Lovecraftian horror, to this Eldritch horror, to this cosmic horror, and what's a story for you that works along those elements? So what's one of kind of the elements, motifs, tropes that really does speak to that for you?
I think the whole concept of the unspeakable text, the banned book from which they will drop little bits of quotes and which holds horrible secrets, that is a recurring motif in a lot of Lovecraft and in pretty much most of the people who do Lovecraftian stuff. And it is just cool because it allows you to work, creepy little lines in without anyone having to say them. It gives you a source for whatever magic has to be done. And there is I think it's in Robert E. Howard's A Thing on the Roof, because Howard did a number of Lovecraftian pieces. And there is a book, Adaptations, which is unspeakable cults. And as we learn in the backstory to this story, the author put it together, and then he was working on a second book, and he died torn to pieces inside a locked room. And then the narrator goes on to say the author of Adaptations, his best friend took his notes and put them together with an idea to releasing them posthumously, read them all through, burned them in a fireplace, slit his own throat with a razor. And, I find things like that are profoundly creepy when they're well done. And it's a motif that adapts to a variety of settings and situations, and it's awesome.
Carole, how about for you? So tropes, ideas, motifs that carry around for you. What's a good example of that?
Well, going from the main mythos of it, of course, you've got like big creepy wet tentacles. And how can you go wrong with that? I agree with Fraser about that whole sense of a horror so horrible that it cannot be stood, and therefore, must be extinguished. And then the best way to do that is to extinguish yourself, because you know it and you understand it and you've seen it and you want to keep anybody else from doing that. And so, you throw yourself on the grenade to protect the rest of humanity. And I just and I mentioned it before, the whole way that perceptions being altered and the inability to tell what is and what is not. Can I trust what my eyes are seeing and what my senses are relaying to me? Is that really what's happening? And does that mean I'm walking safely on this path, or am I in fact walking into the depths of the deep ocean, never to be seen again? Is this a friend or a foe? Because maybe that helping hand they're reaching out is one of those tentacles that's going to slime its way, into your brain or something. So I really like that concept, and that gives you a lot of room to play, when you deal with something like that, of course, because, it's anything that can happen in your mind. And how is that happening in relationship to the real world?
Derek, how about for you?
Ooh, well, I was talking about, Guyana and Jim Jones. So I think a cult-like gathering of people who have arcane knowledge that that only the elect have access to seems to me to be one of the most recurrent Lovecraftian motifs that I seem to come across. But it's not the only one. There's always the sense that somehow the world is far deeper and far stranger than we can ever understand. I'm going to do a quick anecdote, and then I'm going to relay a couple of different stories with regards to that. But about 20 years ago, I was in Hawaii, and my then wife and I went snorkeling, and she kept telling me time and again, "Don't look out there. You need to keep your vision down at the bottom of the of where we are, and then towards the beach." And I said, "Yeah, okay, that's fine." So we got in the water, and I'm looking down, I'm checking everything out. Little water gets into my mask, so I think I turn my head the wrong way, and all I see is nothing but an expanse of blue. And the next thing I know, I'm being pulled out of the water because I'm hyperventilating, because all of a sudden space has just completely opened up for me, and I can't get my head around that. So, I think of things like it's not quite the same thing, but there's the moment in the novella The Visible Filth by Nathan Ballingrud, where this protagonist has found he's a barkeeper, and he finds a cell phone left by somebody, and just out of curiosity he starts scrolling through the pictures, and he sees these kids just marveling at this decapitated skull, and then something is creeping out of it. It's that sense of frisson, and where is this all coming from? How did something that insane get here? That really does sort of that for me is really the essence of what Lovecraftian horror should actually do.
Jenny?
That question. I'm really been wrapped up in everybody's answers, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to.
Just kind of talking about the themes, the tropes, just the essence of Lovecraft, right? What is one of those things that really speaks to you? That sense of what defines that kind of story, and something, an example that works for you.
Okay, well, Robert E. Howard. I know Fraser mentioned him already, but I feel like every Conan story is just one look over your shoulder away, and there's a Cthulhu monster of some kind right behind Conan. Okay, they're very eldritch horror-y, which I think Howard did really well. And I read Conan really like last year, and it was like, wow, there's a lot of Lovecraft in here, and that's probably why I like it. But I really feel Howard did a really good job. And so it's just that eerie, when you can get the feeling of the eerie otherworldness in. One of the things I did in Relating was they're traveling this path that this Indian girl is taking them on, right? And they're evil, horrible people. And there's writing, and it's not writing they can read. It kind of glows, and it feels, and the more our POV character is looking at it, the more creeped out he is. It's like everything is creepy. He turns around and the guys behind him are gone and nobody cares, and just things like that. I think for me, how you get that Lovecraftian feel is you make your POV character or characters really creeped out by stuff that everybody else is kind of ignoring. Like, why is nobody else noticing that we just out of a gang of 7, we're down to 5, right? And all we did was turn a corner. Why is nobody else creeped out by this? Why is everybody else hearing that chittering? I hear chittering. I hear what sound like nails on the wall. Why is nobody else reacting? I think when you can do that, you really get that Lovecraftian feel of there's something, it's like he's standing right behind me, isn't he? Right? That's it. It's like that's right behind me. If I turn around at the wrong time, I'm going to see something I don't want to see. Conan can handle seeing it. I don't know that anybody else can. So I really think you have to get that atmospheric feeling and that feeling of almost claustrophobic dread that nobody else seems to be going through. Because then, it's just either you're crazy or it's targeting you. There doesn't feel like or it's already gotten them. So I just think that Lovecraft did that really, really well. And those of us who are trying to imitate, the closer we can get to that eerie feeling of, it's right behind me, isn't he? The better.
Marx?
Yeah, I think there's lots of tropes you can play with just for comedy and stuff, but for fear aspect, I think what makes it stand out, rather than like jump scares and slasher films or something, is that it's the strangeness, the weirdness aspect of it, the otherness of it. We're kind of used to vampires, werewolves, and stuff, so we're only so scared of that concept. But I think this brings about fears of madness, of our grip on reality. It's like none of us, mental health is a terrible thing to think about happening. Losing your grip on reality from that. And that's a pretty scary thing. And I think it can happen in real life. And also, or the fear of no one believing you when you know the truth. But also, question your entire belief of reality. What if we get out in space and we find out, oh no, the galaxy's formed completely different than we thought, and look, there's a giant Cthulhu out there. Oh no, and now it's seeing us. It questions reality. It questions beliefs. These cultists are very nihilistic. Who they're not thinking they're going to a heaven or something. They're thinking of total destruction, and we're just insects, which is completely different than any other organized religion out there. We always have a paradise we're going to. It comforts us, whereas this is completely opposite, and that's very scary to think of. So there's a lot of this sense of madness, is losing grip of reality, this sense of dread and fear, and then the otherness and bizarreness of it that's just impossible to fully comprehend. And I think those are the things that really creep people out. And why it resonates and sticks around, and it's so hard to capture on film too.
Well, we're going to kind of go into a last little speed round, and Carole, I'm going to start with you on this one. Because there's always a ton of things that we think about. We'll never get to everything in any of these, right? So, what's something that we need to talk about with Lovecraft, Lovecraftian stories? Something we haven't hit on that you think we need to mention?
I'm going to go back to the language. There is a richness in his language that you don't see often, and you certainly don't see it often in modern, I think, horror.
And a tightness, though sometimes rambling. A tightness, but sometimes rambling.
Yes. So he takes his time to really build an image, an atmosphere, or the action of what's happening in a really deep, rich way. I mean, some writers write in a spare way, and it can be beautiful. I'm not saying that's bad. It can be beautiful. I mentioned Bradbury before. He writes in a very poetic way. He's writing prose, but it's a very poetic, in what he is, how he is using his language and the images he's bringing forth. With Lovecraft, it's like really, really rich fudge. Like it's almost chewy when you're biting into it, but the flavor just like explodes on your tongue. And that's, to me, a real hallmark of his writing, and one of the reasons I adored it so much. And I think probably one of the reasons that modern day readers don't get into it or don't read it as much, because they're coming up through reading a whole different set of stories. And this is in no way a good thing, a good versus bad. It's just different. And so even people who were reading before my generation, let's say, might have found it more accessible because it was much more common day. Even for me, it had to, I had to kind of dive into it. I just happen to really like that kind of writing, and so it's a shame to see it not kind of get passed on and not see more people enjoying it newly, finding it afresh, because I think then, as a writer, certainly it can't help but infuse you, because when you have that kind of love of language, you want to use all the words. And I don't mean like you're going to the thesaurus every day to pick out, but all these words have flavor and texture, and I want to impart that. I want to use that and impart that in my writing, and I want to read that in other people's writing. And that, to me, is a really precious element of it. And we can see it in other horror writers, of that era. I mean, one of the reasons I love the original, the OG Dracula, is you get that feeling, the writing is very evocative and the imagery is very vivid, and yet people now would try to read it and they're just like, yeah, no, I can't, It takes a different level of concentration and a language appreciation. And as you can see, I'm very passionate about this.
So, Derek, how about for you? What's something we haven't touched on that we need to throw out there?
I'm going to springboard a little bit off of what Carole was saying. So here's the thing that's really fascinating. Lovecraft is using 19th century language, prose so purple it can spill into the ultraviolet. And he's using this 19th century language to basically talk about very, especially early 20th century ideas. We are talking about the vastness of scale, which you're really only seeing in the likes at that point of H.G. Wells. You're seeing it really kind of in embryo, somebody like Olive Stapleton, who really didn't care so much about, plot or character, but was really interested in how strange and different the universe can be. I grant you that Lovecraft saw that entire vastness and the utter indifference and looked at that with absolute horror. It almost spills him into an absurdist sort of view. How can a mere mortal comprehend something that is so unbelievably vast? How can you wrap your brain around infinity? It makes him, in a way, a kind of pulp Camus, just because, he's he's basically saying we are insignificant in the cosmic view. You know, you have this guy who's basically saying, and I'm going to use late 20th century language, you know, but he's basically saying, this is you. This is the entirety of humanity. We're standing on a rock in a universe that simply doesn't care about us. And it's only slightly different from somebody like, say, Philip K. Dick, who would say, and all of that's in a very New England sort of tone. And Philip Dick is SoCal going, all right, yeah, you're on this entirety of humanity is standing on this insignificant rock. Now, how do we know humanity's actually standing on it? Which is an entirely different sort of, that's a route that Lovecraft never really goes to, but it's very much his is very much a worldview that basically is leaving behind as much as possible supernaturalism. We're not dealing with ghosts. We're not dealing really with vampires, but instead we are dealing with something far stranger. Is Cthulhu evil? No, he just doesn't care. Is Yog-Sothoth trying to devour humanity only to eat because it needs to eat? It doesn't care any other way. That's that is the most remarkable thing to me, is that you're dealing in essence with a writer using the tropes of the 19th century to talk about very modern ideas that still linger to this day.
We're nothing but grapes to the monsters. Jenny?
I agree with what both Carol and Derek so eloquently have said. I am going to, what I think we've avoided is the continuous demands that somebody who is long dead conform to current mores. I am personally very sick of hearing how evil Lovecraft was. Hey everyone, Shakespeare's an anti-Semite. Should I never read his works again? Oh, no, because it's the bard. And Lovecraft is a bard for this. This guy took something that no one was talking about, no one was seeing, and opened up this vast world that is terrifying, but also, maybe we can fight it, maybe we can't, but he took things in a way people had not before, had not in a really hundreds of years. Somebody who's alive today, yeah, get your ship in order. Someone who's long dead, I am super tired of hearing, well, Lovecraft is this. Yeah, you know what he also was? Kind of a sweet guy in a very stuck way. I actually have him and a lot of other dead people in my Necropolis Enforcement Files series. And he's a character I love. I love writing HP. He's adorable, right? He's fun. He's witty. He's got a capricious sense of humor. Why? Because I look at some of the stuff the guy wrote, right? Okay, somewhere in there, in between horror, he's got to be laughing, right? Because oh my God, you guys, we're doing this. We better have some humor coming out from somebody else, because I'm showing you what we've got. Someone make us laugh about it. So I think a lot of why Lovecraft doesn't get read as much today is because he's gotten this, you were a bad person by the 2020 standards. The guy, that's not fair. That's not right. Yes, okay, all these things were bad when they were happening, but none of y'all would have been sitting there going, well, how dare you think like that? Because that's how people were thinking. So I think it's dangerous. I think it's never a good idea to say, well, somebody doesn't conform to my standards of this minute because they've been dead for 150 years. How dare they? People are going to look, 150 years, if we're all still here, please God, they're going to look back at our morals and be going, what was wrong with those people? Well, I'm certainly not going to read anything from those people because they have those morals, right? We can't change them once we're dead. So I think part of why Lovecraft is, yes, he's dense, and yes, you have to be in the right mindset to read it. I took in all of Lovecraft at 12 with no issues. 12 and 13, no issues with Lovecraft whatsoever. Now, being a great big grown-up girl who writes for herself, I don't write in that style, so it's really hard to get through. But The Outsider isn't. The Outsider is still perfect. It's still heartbreaking. I can read that anytime, and all I want to do is cry. So the man had a gift, and people should not be judging his writing on something he didn't live long enough to change. So I think that's why he's been left. That's my Lovecraft soapbox, and I bring it up anytime it comes up because it drives me nuts. Because his writing should be read. He was hugely influential.
Marx, what's something we haven't touched on?
You've all touched on so much. I guess just I would say if you're going to write, especially horror, to definitely read his stories if you haven't already, to learn. You may not use as purple prose as that, but just to see where those influences come from. I would also take a look at some of his influences or other authors that time period past, like Tina Yellow was really great, and Greg God Pan stands stuck in my mind too. And then also you can take, and if you're a filmmaker, I would take a look at like a lot of the movies we mentioned, especially like Endless and some of the other movies. Or if you're more of a comedy person, I always kind of like the last Lovecraft, Relic of Cthulhu, which is pretty wild. And of course, we talked about Reanimator. Well, that's comedy horror, but Suitable Flesh just came out, kind of a nod to that genre. So those are some good stuff. And True Detective, Lovecraft Country. I would love to see just more things that are putting nods, good stuff. That's not just body horror, but also good storytelling, touching on those topics and themes. Because he definitely, I'm sure he never. It's too bad he couldn't live long enough to really see the effect. But it's I think every author would love, if you can't get rich and famous, he would love at least your work to live on well past you, and his has.
I'll take the rich and famous, and then have it live. Oh, well, never mind. Fraser, how about for you?
I'm going to go. Well, sorry, Gini, I'm going to go there. I mean, I'm a huge Lovecraft fan, and this does not stop me reading him, but he was a racist and a xenophobe, and it is a little creepy hearing him make rants about the horrible, subhuman, degraded immigrants polluting New England, and realize you could see them from a lot of people in the modern world, and it's not pleasant. I still read him, and I still like him, and more annoyingly, you see people doing Lovecraftian fiction in the 80s and even in this century, and they just perpetuate the tropes. Like, oh yes, the Native Americans had horrible devil gods and committed unspeakable sacrifices. And okay, you can respect Lovecraft and imitate Lovecraft. You do not have to imitate everything about him.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
Well, before we close the Necronomicon this evening, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, and of course, what's the book that they need to pick up. So, Derek, I'll go to you first.
Sure. You can find me at DerekAustinJohnson.com. That's my website. I'm on the Book of Faces, and I'm on the Clock app, as well as Where Skies Are Blue. You can and if you wanted some idea of my own sort of Lovecraftian sensibilities, my story Prodigal is in CF Page's anthology Anterior Skies. It's really a remarkable anthology that I'd recommend just for the sheer breadth and scope of the talent. I'm always kind of humbled that I got to play in that sandbox.
Jenny?
GiniKoch.com. If you want to join my free newsletter, hook me up. You can do so easily from the bottom of most of the pages on my website. I'm all over Facebook, still on X, Twitter, Blue Sky, and Pinterest. The book that I was talking about the most was the Mammoths of Cthulhu Volume 1. This is one of my big brags because I'm like the littlest author in this. I'm also I'm in many, but A Secret Guide to Fighting Elder Gods, where we had to take a Lovecraftian story and do something else with it. So my story in here is Pickman's Daughter. And then Submerged from Zombie Needs Brains, which is another anthology, and where I totally went for Lovecraftian horror with The City Under the Sea. And that's a complete homage, other than no racism. People are killed indiscriminately of what their race is.
Equal opportunity killing.
Oh, yes. Equal opportunity madness for all.
Marx?
You can find me at marxpyle.com or at cabotcrossing.com. It's a cabot like a rabbit, just a C instead of an R. And we just came out with, not too long ago, Enchanted Tales and Twisted Lore and Once Upon a Twisted Time. There's one story in here that's like a mix of Poe and Lovecraft. And then my urban fantasy novel, Unsoothing Monsters and Fools, coming out later this year. If you explore the haunted house of Kindavella, you can see some of it early on there still remains, which has there's a supporting character who's a deep one, and there's some other Lovecraft stuff in there.
Fraser?
I'm Fraser Sherman. You can find me at frasersherman.com, FRASER, where there are several pages that list my books and my stories. I'm on Facebook and Blue Sky. My most recent Lovecraftian thing is a story in Ceaseless Way, an anthology that came out late last year, Fiddler's Black, which is a sort of sequel to the music of Eric Zahn.
And Carole?
As Carole Stokes, I'm on Facebook in many continual panels. As Ellis Colton, I write romance. My most recent book is The Case of Thistledown House. And the sequel that I was referring to is The Malevolent Sea, which will be out in a couple of weeks.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingprose.com, and of course here ConTinual. And we will see you again soon. Well, probably. We're all mad here.